And finally, we're very glad to have with us today Matt Segall and Spiridon Petroufinis. And Matt will introduce Spiridon, but I want to say a word about Matt. I've been studying his work for years and admiring him for years. He's the chair of the Science Advisory Board of the Cobb Institute. He's on the board of trustees of the California Institute for Integral Studies, where he teaches. His position is in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. And if you can't imagine a better position to have such an integration, and that's Matt's nature. He's deeply integrative in his whole way of thinking. He's the author of several books and hundreds of articles. His first book was The Reemergence of Schelling, Philosophy in a Time of Emergency. More after that was Physics of the World Soul, Whitehead's Adventure in Cosmology, and still more recently, Crossing the Threshold, Etheric Imagination in the Post-Kantian Process Philosophy of Schelling and Whitehead. He has written on so many topics that it's almost impossible to limit him to any particular subject. But today, I think our conversation with Spiridon will be at the intersection of process and biology. And with that, Matt, I'll hand it over to you to introduce Spiridon, and we'll get going.
Thank you so much, Jay, for welcoming us and for that introduction. I'm very excited to see so many familiar faces and some new faces here at the Cobb Institute's Cobb and Friends Tuesday. Today, my friend and colleague Spiridon and I will be discussing biophilosophy and this new book that has just been published about a few months ago. And as Jay mentioned, this is sort of a preview for a seminar series that will begin on Saturdays later this month, not this Saturday, but the next. And we are carrying forward a kind of tradition that's building now with the Cobb Institute of doing these seminar series through the Science Advisory Committee. Those of you who are familiar with Tim Eastman's work and his book Untying the Gordian Knot will remember the last seminar we did, almost 2 years ago now that started, and it went on for about 6 months, where we invited all of the contributors, or rather the other scientists and philosophers that Tim Eastman had drawn upon in his book to come engage in dialogue with him. That was more focused on physics, though, as is often the case with scientists and philosophers influenced by the process worldview. It's very hard to stay within the standard disciplinary boundaries of physics. And so, Tim Eastman's book was already bleeding into questions about biology and the nature of consciousness and so on. But today and in this new series focused on process philosophical perspectives on biology, we're really going to be focusing on the organic world, but again, understanding life, as we'll see as I begin to ask Spiridon some questions here, does require reimagining the physical world and what we believe it is capable of and what its true nature is. So let me introduce Spiridon properly. He's a associate professor of philosophy at the Technical University of Berlin. He was between 2012 and 2014 a visiting associate professor at the University of California, Berkeley, not too far from me here in Northern California. And he specializes in process philosophy and what he calls biophilosophy, which I'll ask him about in a minute, as well as classical metaphysics and complexity theory. And he's trying to develop in much of his work a new theory of the organism, right, which he's worked out in a variety of books, 6 other books and numerous articles and book chapters. Good to be with you today, Spiridon. Thanks for joining us. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions here as a way into not only this book, but your research more broadly. So usually when philosophers engage with the life sciences, it's described as the philosophy of biology or theoretical biology, maybe. But you've tried to articulate this new approach to the philosophical study of the sciences of life that you call bio-philosophy. And I wonder if you could just introduce us to this distinction that you're drawing between standard philosophy of biology and the biophilosophical approach.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank you for the introduction of my person and my work. And I would also like to express my thankfulness to the Cobb Institute for this very kind invitation. So your first question is about the relation between biophilosophy and philosophy of biology. So I should maybe say at the beginning that biophilosophy is not a term that I have created. So the first biologist and also philosopher who created the term was Hans Driesch, actually the best known or the most famous neo-vitalist. And this term was created around 1910. And many other people use that term, but this term has often different meanings. So I would like now to introduce my understanding of that term. And I would like to read, because otherwise it will take us very long. And since English is my second foreign language, it's much easier for me to read, okay? So the first point is on the differences between biophilosophy and contemporary philosophy of biology. Many authors use the terms philosophy of biology and biophilosophy as if they were synonymous. I do not think that these two labels should be used synonymously, in contrast to most scholars who understand themselves as philosophers of biology and who in their reflections about the nature of matter and causality almost never contravene the basic metaphysical framework dictated by today's mainstream biology. The philosophical presuppositions of the biophilosophers follow very different metaphysical systems. So there is not just one biophilosophy. This being said, however, it is important to note that the borders between both fields, biophilosophy and philosophy of biology, are fluid. In my own work, I try to establish an understanding of the term biophilosophy that summarizes philosophical traditions, some of which have existed since antiquity, and consider biological questions and concepts from different and often very heterogeneous philosophical perspectives, but which still have an essential metaphysical common feature. I'm going to talk about this essential metaphysical common feature in a few minutes. So first, I would like to present a list that includes most of the philosophical and scientific schools of thought that have contributed significantly to biophilosophical thinking. So this will be not a list of biophilosophies, but a list of the philosophical sources of biophilosophy. So for example, Aristotelian and neo-Aristotelian approaches to life, idealism and romantic philosophy, Kant, Schelling, Hegel, Schopenhauer, and Carl Gustav Carus. Carus was a German physician who lived in the early 19th century and a contemporary of Schelling. So he was a romantic philosopher and I would say biophilosopher. Then Goetheanism, I mean the tradition around the work of Wolfgang von Goethe. Vitalism and neo-vitalism. For example, Paracelsus and Van Helmont, they lived in the late medieval time, in the early modern period. Then Georg Ernst Stahl, he was a so-called psycho-vitalist. And of course, Hans Driesch, the best-known neo-vitalist. Then 20th century German-speaking biologists and physicians, such as Jakob von Uexküll, Adolf Portmann. Adolf Portmann was from Switzerland, and he emphasized the interiority of animals. Then Kurt Goldstein, a German Jewish neurologist, physician, who worked in Berlin and is one of the founders of the classical theory of organism. Victor von Weizsäcker, a German physician with a very strong philosophical background. He was one of the founders of Gestalt theory. Of course, process metaphysics, Henri Bergson and Alfred North Whitehead. We all know Bergson's creative evolution. And a series of biologists that were strongly inspired by Whitehead. For example, Wilfred A.D. Agar. He was an Anglo-Australian zoologist, and he wrote in 1941 one book about organism that was strongly influenced by Whitehead. Then Ralph Steiner Lilly, a Canadian biologist, he wrote in the 1940s after Agar another Whiteheadian biophilosophical book. Charles Birch, he's a very well-known Australian biologist who wrote together with John the book, The Liberation of Life. Then phenomenology, I should mention Hans Jonas, who put so much emphasis on the interiority and subjectivity of all living beings, even of the simplest bacteria, Maurice Merleau-Ponty and some others. Then, of course, I should mention the famous French 20th century physician, biologists, and philosophers, such as Georges Canguilhem. Georges Canguilhem, the teacher of Michel Foucault, was probably the most important biophilosopher of the 20th century. Gilbert Simondon, Raymond Ruyère, and Gilles Deleuze. Then biopolitics, Foucault and Agamben. Ecological ethics. In this connection, I would like to mention Barbara Muraka. I think we all know her very well. She is a well-known process philosopher and ecological ethicist. Then feministic approaches to biology. For example, provided by Donna Haraway, Rossi Braidotti, Dibolina Roy, and others. Dibolina Roy describes herself as biophilosopher. She is a biologist and works, and a feminist, of course, and works at the Emory University. Then I should mention mnemonism. Mnemonism and the theory of morphic resonance or morphic fields. Ewald Hering, an Austrian biologist of the second half of the 19th century, is the one who introduced the term mneme and mnemonism. He held a famous lecture on 1879 at the Vienna Academy of Science, where he said that embryogenesis should be understood as a process of recollection, of remembering. Richard Shimon is the most famous mnemonist. He wrote the classical mnemonic work. It is called the Mneme, or Die Mneme in German, and he died in 1918. Then Eugenio Rignano, an Italian neo-Lamarckist philosopher who wrote on mnemonism in the 1930s. Gernot Falkner, a very good friend of mine, Austrian biologist and convinced Whiteheadian and Bergsonian. Unfortunately, he died. He passed away 1 year ago, and he did a lot of work on the memory of bacteria. He contributed a very interesting chapter to the book we're talking about today, and I'm going to say a little about his chapter in a few minutes. And then, of course, Rupert Sheldrake. Everybody knows him. I should not, therefore, I don't think that I should say more about him. Last but not least, and I mean it very seriously, not least, non-Western approaches to life, understanding of key biological concepts such as evolution and organism, and theories, biological theories such as theory of evolution from the perspective of Hindu, Buddhist, and African philosophers and thinkers of indigenous notions. I would like to put a lot of emphasis on that last point, because I really think that biophilosophy should not be focused just on the Western biological and biophilosophical tradition. So in my own work, I try to accommodate the above-mentioned schools of thought under a new comprehensive understanding of biophilosophy. The reason for this is that although not all of them, at least most of these schools share a common central metaphysical characteristic. They implicitly and often explicitly attribute interiority and subjectivity to organisms and all cells, even to the simplest of them. So even to the simplest bacteria. Acts of experience that have phenomenal qualities, or qualia, occur constantly in organisms and cells. These phenomenal qualities or qualia have a significant causal influence on the dynamics of the corresponding organisms and cells, and therefore cannot be dismissed as so-called epiphenomena. So this is the working hypothesis that, in my opinion, is the strongest common metaphysical characteristic of maybe 90% of the schools that I have presented in my list. Now I would like to, in order to answer Matt's questions, I would like to focus on philosophy of biology. This means on the metaphysical opposite to what I call biophilosophy. So philosophy of biology is a discipline which was founded in the early 1970s by Michael Ruse, an American philosopher, and David Hull, a British philosopher, but which had also had some precursors. For example, Beckner, who wrote a book about philosophy of biology in 1959. The best known representatives of this discipline, which has become especially established in the Anglo-Saxon world, are theoretical biologists and philosophers. Some of the most influential contributions to philosophy of biology have been provided by Francisco Ayala. So now I'm going to name some of the most important or most influential, at least, philosophers of biology in an alphabetical order. So again, Francisco Ayala, Theodosius Dobzhansky, John Dupré, Stephen Good, Paul Griffiths, Eva Jablonka, Richard Lewontin, Humberto Maturana, Ernst Mayr, Susan Oyama, Alexander Rosenberg, Eliot Zober, Tim Sterelny, Francisco Varela, and Dennis Walls. So three of them, Stephen Good, Stephen Good, Richard Lewontin, and Ernst Mayr were Harvard professors for biology. And Ernst Mayr did a lot for the foundation of philosophy of biology. In the writings of many philosophers of biology, the Anglo-Saxon analytic style of thinking and reasoning, for example, the focus on the structure of scientific language, is more or less predominant. Today's philosophy of biology is built upon metaphysical assumptions about the nature of matter, causality, and mental agency, and their respective places in the cosmos that are substantially different from the metaphysical assumptions of Aristotelian, Jonasian, Bergsonian, Whiteheadian, and other biophilosophy. Most philosophers of biology follow the metaphysical principles of classical physics, of course in a version that is expanded to include the idea of dynamical systems, which include the theories of complexity, self-organization, and chaos. For the purposes of this presentation, the following basic metaphysical principles are important because they are explicitly rejected. Again, they are explicitly rejected by most biophilosophers, and not just by those who hold a process metaphysical perspectives. So now I'm going to present three, in my opinion, main metaphysical principles of philosophy of biology, but I should say at the beginning that you will not find those principles explicitly stated in the articles or books of philosophers of biology. They are, I think they consider those things to be self-evident. So the first principle, mental activity is inseparably connected to brain activity. This applies to conscious and unconscious mental activity. So this means that plants, simple multicell organisms, and single-cell organisms do not experience anything. The ability to experience arose relatively late in the history of evolution and is reducible to complex physical-chemical patterns of activity in neural systems. So the next principle is, in my opinion, the following. Mental or other factors which cannot be reduced to physico-chemical processes possess no causal relevance for biological occurrences. Acts of experience are irrelevant to ontogenesis and evolution, even though they may appear to be an important evolutionary factor due to their role in partner selection. In reality, however, they are causally irrelevant epiphenomena, which can be reduced to the interaction of neural, genetic, and signal networks. Within the ideological framework of physicalistic reductionism, phenomenal qualities, or qualia, such as the experience of joy, hunger, beauty, fear, sympathy, and antipathy, are understood as epiphenomena of complex, blind, this means in this connection, not mental, physico-chemical processes. So I'm talking not about the objective side of experience, but about the interior subjective side of experience. The causal relevance of the subjective side of experience is rejected. Epiphenomenalism and materialistic eliminativism force biologists to reject the causal relevance of the interiority and subjectivity of experience to the behavior even of higher animals, and I should say even of humans. When viewed from the perspective using mental factors, and especially phenomenal qualities, to explain the striving of organisms for nourishment, safety, procreation, or migrating to a particular place, makes no sense. The third point, or the third principle, all processes in an organism can be understood as arising from the interaction of material entities that are strictly localized spatio-temporally. Ideas in quantum physics, such as the non-local entanglement between elementary particles, are generally not considered to be relevant in biology, including brain physiology. For this reason, the ideas of classical physics about matter and determinism, again, in a version expanded by the theories of complexity, self-organization, and chaos, are sufficient for understanding the causal relations in biological processes, for example, in singular processes as well as in metabolic, genetic, and neural networks. So I'm not claiming that they don't know anything about quantum biology. I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is that they tend to to consider it to be not very relevant. So at least I don't know any of serious considerations of quantum biological or quantum physical ideas in the orthodox philosophy of biology that is presented in textbooks and especially in conferences. So these assumptions do not say anything about these three principles. I mean, do not say anything about the methodology of biology, as they are metaphysical assumptions about the nature of the matter and causality of organisms. As metaphysical hypotheses, however, they indicate the worldview of modern biology. I mean, the predominant worldview of modern biology. They also make clear that current Anglo-Saxon philosophy of biology reflects core concepts and theories of biology from a metaphysical perspective on the nature of matter and causality, which Whitehead called scientific materialism. In my opinion, the most central characteristic of this bioscientific materialism, of which I've presented three principles, is that there must be no relying on the so-called supernatural in scientific explanations. This usually includes not only ideas of God, but also everything, and this is very important for us today, everything which cannot be understood using the methods of physics and chemistry. In other words, this also includes interiority or phenomenal qualities or qualia of experience. John wrote an article, a book chapter about that, that was published in a volume that I edited and was published in 2014 called Life and Process. And in his chapter, John quotes extensively Richard Lewontin, the famous Harvard biologist and philosopher of biology. And Lewontin is one of the very few philosophers of biology who makes explicitly clear that supernatural does not mean only God. It means also interiority, subjectivity, qualia, and all these things with which physics and I mean, at least classical physics, not necessarily quantum physics, but classical physics and contemporary biology does not deal with or do not deal with. So from this point of view, since nature is considered to be purely the totality of material and energetic phenomena, mental agency can only be considered as supernatural. Whereas most philosophers of biology operate within this metaphysical framework dictated by contemporary mainstream biology, the basic assumptions of most biophilosophers, including myself, break these barriers. So I don't want to say more about that, Matt, but I would like to ask you whether you would like to add something about Whitehead's understanding of scientific materialism. And I'm asking you that because I think that this is exactly what we're dealing with in the situation in contemporary biology and philosophy of biology, scientific materialism.
Yes, thanks, Spiridon. Very helpful introduction to this difference between biophilosophy and philosophy of biology, which, as you're pointing out, presupposes this materialistic background. In Whitehead's first book after coming to America to take up a faculty position in the philosophy department at Harvard, his book Science in the Modern World, he tells this history of science, which in the early 20th century, as a result of its own methods, attempting to be as reductionistic as possible, physics itself overcame materialism. These ideas of simple location were overturned by both quantum and relativity theories. And this shift in mathematical physics is what drew one of the reasons that Whitehead was drawn into philosophy and into metaphysics, because he realized 20th century science needs a new metaphysical underbelly. It needs a new philosophy to replace the old mechanistic philosophy. And so I've found a few relevant quotes here from Science in the Modern World, where Whitehead is discussing scientific materialism. And, you know, as he puts it here, it's this idea that nature is ultimately just brute matter spread through space in a flux of configurations. It's senseless, it's valueless, it's purposeless. And it follows a fixed routine imposed by external relations, in other words, by these kind of arbitrary laws, which do not spring from the nature of the material particles, say. They're just kind of imposed, and all of the original founders of modern science, Newton, Descartes, Galileo, and so on, Newton and Descartes in particular were deists, right? The laws determining the motion of matter through space were established by God, right? And Whitehead rejects this view, because he says it's entirely unsuited to the scientific situation at which we have now arrived. He admits, though, that under the right abstract conditions, it can still express important facts. But the problem here is one of his other insights that he first articulates in Science and the Modern World, his famous fallacy of misplaced concreteness. The materialistic view of nature puts an abstract view in place of our concrete experience. And then when we try to fit our own concrete experience into this materialistic universe, we run into all sorts of paradoxes and contradictions. So he says, when we pass beyond the abstraction of this idea of material particles that are fully present at an instant, right? When we pass beyond this abstraction, either by more subtle employment of our senses or by the request for meanings and for coherence of thoughts, the scheme breaks down at once, right? And so while it has a narrow efficiency within its properly limited domains of relevance, as an account of the ultimate nature of nature, or certainly of life, materialism just falls short. He points out a bit later on page 36 of Science in the Modern World that the idea of matter itself is increasingly, in his day, was being replaced by this notion of vibration. And he makes clear that when physicists talk about energy, they're again talking about a kind of quantitative abstraction, a quantitative measure, and that if we want to know what nature is concretely speaking, we need to say more than just that it is this quantity that can be measured called energy. And so he introduces the notion of organism, which he's generalizing beyond biology so as to apply, I would say, to self-organizing systems at all scales in nature, right? And so Whitehead's philosophy of organism is in a way an account of the universe in its evolution in terms of self-organization, right? And so biological organisms become one example of this broader theme that characterizes organizations, right, at all scales. And he draws on the poets, many different poets in Science in the Modern World, including Tennyson, who has this line, "The stars blindly run." And Whitehead uses this as a stark statement of the problem with this new materialistic worldview that was arising out of modern science, that it left no room for our human consciousness and sense of agency, right? And so we end up in this situation where we have two irreconcilable points of view. The one coming from this materialistic science that tells us, look, atoms and molecules blindly run, they obey these fixed laws. The human body is itself a collection of these molecules, and so we must blindly run. And yet we know that we are not blind. We have this rich inner life of qualia, of emotions, of wishes and desires. And Whitehead thinks to properly understand not only the biological world, but also the physical world, we need to find a way to integrate this interior subjective dimension that's so obvious to us from this first person point of view, and to make it compatible with what we do want from science, which is a third person point of view, but not the kind of third person point of view that would force us to eliminate our interior experience. And I think Spiridon is laying out for us how this biophilosophical approach, this heterodox alternative stream, which goes way back, is an attempt to devise a more integral conception of nature, which makes room for both the inside and the outside of the universe. So, Spiridon, let's move along now to what we could call the neo-mechanistic or new mechanical philosophy and its role in biology. Whitehead points out in so many words in Science in the Modern World that while physics has left mechanism behind over a century ago now, the biologists seem to have not gotten the memo. So what's going on here?
Yes, so this is a very important point because there is a huge neo-mechanistic attack. I think most philosophers and Whiteheaders don't know that. But if you deal with philosophy of science, and especially with philosophy of life science, you're very aware of that development. So should share again my screen. So let's move to the second point. I gave him a somehow funny title, The Seemingly Unstoppable Advance of Neo-Mechanistic Thought in Contemporary Biology and Philosophy of Biology. In contemporary sciences, real or theoretical causal structures that produce or predict the course and outcome of natural or artificial phenomena are generally referred to as mechanisms. Accordingly, in modern life sciences, a satisfactory explanation of a phenomenon is identified with the formulation of a theoretical mechanism. So the point 2.1, mechanisms and the so-called new mechanical philosophy. The talk of mechanisms is very common in today's biology and medicine. Biological textbooks and articles are replete with references to genetic, metabolic, biochemical, and other types of mechanisms, such as the mechanism of photosynthesis, mechanism of digestion, and mechanism of respiration. And there are also thousands of other mechanisms. So the dependence of modern scientific research on mechanisms is so undeniable that it has even received philosophical underpinning. One of the most dynamically developing areas of contemporary philosophy of science is the so-called new mechanical philosophy or new mechanism. Its leading advocates have introduced several definitions of the term mechanism into the philosophy of biology in recent decades. Here you can see some of the names of some of them, I would say, of the most important philosophers, mechanistic philosophers of today. So for Glennon, I quote, a mechanism underlying a behavior is a complex system which produces that behavior by the interaction of a number of parts according to direct causal laws, end of quote. According to a new version of this definition, I quote, a mechanism for a phenomenon consists of entities or parts whose activities and interactions are organized so as to be responsible for the phenomenon, end of quote. These statements indicate the implicit systems theoretical underpinning of the term mechanism, since interacting entities can only be characterized as parts if they are viewed as elements of a system. For Macomber, Darder, and Craver, I would say the founding fathers of new mechanism, I quote, mechanisms are entities and activities organized such that they are productive of regular changes from start or set up to finish or termination conditions, end of quote. The setup conditions consist of both the start conditions, relevant entities and initial conditions, and the enabling conditions, for example, boundary conditions, which are often labeled constraints of a phenomenon. By termination conditions, the authors mean a privilege, I quote, a privileged endpoint such as rest, equilibrium, or an end of quote, or an activated state. In systems biology, computer simulation shows how the explanandum results from deployment of a mathematical model that is an abstract mechanism. So the explanans is a mathematical model, and this mathematical model, usually a system of, usually not always, but usually a system of differential equations, is an abstract mechanism. Computer simulations of both small and large systems of equations are considered mechanistic explanations. Complex mathematical models consisting of coupled differential equations have been introduced, among other things, for the computations of the cell cycle. At this point, it should be noted that in the new mechanical philosophy, the term mechanism and mechanistic, the terms mechanism and mechanistic are applied to all kinds of scientifically describable events, and not only to those studied by theoretical mechanics. So the talk of mechanism and mechanistic does not have anything to do with theoretical mechanics, with Newtonian mechanics, etc. It's much more general. As philosophers of biology, Manner and Bunge say, I quote, "The only condition for a mechanism to be taken seriously in modern science is that it be material, lawful, and scrutable." Yes, what does scrutable mean? It means rather that it means not immaterial, miraculous, and occult. End of quote. So think of what I said a few minutes ago about the supernatural. Yeah. Immaterial, miraculous, and occult can be here used as a synonymous of supernatural. What I like very much in the writings of Manner and Bunge is that they are always very clear and very explicit. They are a sort of brutal, I would even say, but this is very helpful if you want to understand the mechanistic worldview. Philosopher of biology Danick Walls, he teaches in Canada, summarizes them what he calls mechanical worldview, noting that from the perspective of mechanistic thought, I quote, "To explain a natural phenomenon, one adverts to the causal mechanisms that produce it," end of quote. According to Walsh, proponents of mechanistic thought consider their explanations to be, I quote, complete in the sense that citing causes is sufficient to account fully for the occurrence of an event, and exhaustive too in the sense that every event has a complete mechanistic explanation. End of quote. A very clear language. So why do I think that neo-mechanistic thought or new mechanism does not suffice? Much critical can be said about neo-mechanistic thinking, as it has several essential shortcomings. For reasons of time, I would like to limit myself to the following brief remarks. First, in my opinion, the neo-mechanistic thinking leaves out everything that makes us human, such as three of our essential characteristics that are inextricably linked: interiority, subjectivity, and the ability to experience qualitative phenomena or qualia. The reason for this omission is quite simple. Interiority, subjectivity, and qualitative phenomenality are facts that cannot be recognized by the discursive analytical mode of knowledge that alone dominates in the natural sciences. They are not given to us through measurements and quantifications of external objective facts, but rather directly. After all, they are not measurable and quantifiable. But do not our relationships with our fellow human beings, our ability to communicate with people and understand ourselves as responsible social beings presuppose the metaphysical conviction that all people are subjects that have interiority and consequently, like ourselves, experiences with complex patterns of qualitative phenomena or qualia? Without this assumption, moral behavior is not possible. We cannot behave ethically towards our fellow human beings if we do not attribute to them interiority, subjectivity, and rich experience. But this is precisely what is simply made impossible by the neo-mechanistic descriptions of the human organism and behavior. Not only our fellow human beings, but also ourselves collapse into zombies that can be described by mechanisms. The second point is that the neo-mechanistic thinking undermines our relationships with the animal kingdom, as it also collapses animals into more or less complex zombies. How then, to ask just one of the important questions, can animal ethics be founded? The third point, the neo-mechanistic reductionism also makes the evolution of plants incomprehensible. The development of the colors and smells of flowers and the taste of fruits in evolution cannot be understood without the assumption that insects, vertebrates, and other animals experience optical, and olfactory qualia. There is a fourth point, finally, so I would say a more technical reason to criticize neo-mechanistic thinking, which I can only address very briefly here. In my books, articles, and book chapters, including my own chapter in Intuiting Life, I show that mechanistic explanations face major problems when translated into the exact language of mathematics, as is the case in systems biology. The corresponding mechanisms can only simulate the dynamics of cells and multicellular organisms if they operate under conditions that are biologically unrealistic. So finishing that second point, I would like to ask Matt to say us something about Francisco Varela's turn from a neo-mechanistic theories or a mechanistic theorist to a phenomenologist and even to a Buddhist.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Spiridon. So I think Francisco Varela and also his first teacher and then colleague Humberto Maturana, they developed a approach to theoretical biology in the 60s and 70s known as autopoiesis, which is this Greek term meaning self-production, and the paradigm case of this would be the living cell, which rather than thinking of a living cell as just a bunch of parts arranged in some kind of mechanism, there's a need that they draw from Immanuel Kant, actually, who developed this understanding of self-organization in his Critique of Judgment, that in an organism, the parts produce one another for the sake of the whole. And so there's a kind of final causality at work, a kind of purposiveness. But in their account of autopoiesis originally, Maturana and Varela wanted it to be a purely mechanistic sort of system without any teleology. And this original formulation stood for, I think, a few decades, but then by the 90s, they had both actually shifted their view on this and come to understand, drawing on phenomenology, that there is an interior dimension to the living world. And like you're saying, Spiridon, we can't really understand evolution without it. The taste of fruit, the colors of flowers, there is a coevolutionary process between plants and animals that only makes sense if we grant qualitative experience to the animals. Otherwise, why would there be color in nature? And in my chapter, in our book, I quote Maturana and Varela on the role that emotion plays in the living world, and I just want to read that so that you get a sense for how dramatically their view turned on this. So in their book, The Tree of Knowledge, which was published in 1992 by Shambhala, which is a publishing house that usually publishes works on Buddhism and spirituality, but this was a book on biology. They write, to dismiss love as the biologic basis of social life, as also the ethical implications of love, would be to turn our back on a history as living beings that is more than 3.5 billion years old. We may resist the notion of love in a scientific reflection because we fear for the objectivity of our rational approach. Yet such fear is unfounded. Love is a biological dynamic with deep roots. It is an emotion that defines in the organism as a dynamic structural pattern, a stepping stone to interactions that may lead to the operational coherencies of social life. So here they're connecting this emotion we usually associate with human beings, or maybe if we're slightly more generous, we'll say some other mammals display love in their caretaking of young and so on, and pair bonding. But they're saying that, look, love as this emotion and this social tendency is ubiquitous in the living world, right? Life is not something that just individuals do. And here I think they're correcting a bit of a emphasis on individual selves in their notion of autopoiesis. Donna Haraway, who Spiridon mentioned, likes to emphasize sympoiesis as actually getting closer to the essence of life. Sympoiesis meaning that there's a intrinsic sort of sympathetic resonance among organisms, and that when we think about single living cells, they're always in the context of an ecological set of relationships to other organisms, if not more obviously social in their modes of life. But I want to also point to briefly here a paper. It was Francisco Varela's last paper that he co-wrote with another biologist, Andreas Weber, and it's called Life After Kant. And I'm actually going to share it with you in the chat as well as just briefly on the screen here. So Life After Kant, Natural Purposes and the Autopoietic Foundations of Biological Individuality. And they rehearse the Kantian heritage, as they put it, going back to the critique of judgment and Kant's notion of self-organization, which I had just mentioned earlier. But I want to point out here, they begin by quoting Whitehead. A clash of doctrines is not a disaster, it is an opportunity. And they don't cite him later in the paper directly, but it's very clear that they do have Whitehead's understanding of the mental pole or the subject pole of an actual occasion in mind, because let me switch to this other window to show you what Varela articulates here. He realizes with Weber here that when we're talking about autopoiesis, he says it's not just one more self-organizing mechanism. There is a mechanistic aspect to it, and I think it's an important point to make here is that critics of the mechanistic view of life don't deny that there are mechanical aspects to organisms. I mean, that's why that our joints work and our muscles work. It's just that mechanism is in a way a partial perspective on a larger dynamic, which cannot be reduced merely to parts obeying causal laws. And so those with a more organismic point of view are including but transcending the mechanistic point of view, you could say, whereas the mechanists are saying there is nothing else to explain here. There is no such thing as organism that would be over and above what mechanism can already explain. So autopoiesis for Varela in this late paper becomes not just an account of the way that parts produce one another for the sake of a whole, but he really wants to understand what we might mean by for the sake of. What is the purposiveness that is operative in living organisms down to single cells. And he thinks that really understanding this is going to require rethinking the physicalist view of nature. Because in a living cell, he says, there's a radical transition to the existence of an individual, which for him means that there's a center of concern, he says. And here he's drawing on Hans Jonas, who Spiridon mentioned earlier, that there's an ongoing self-produced identity, and it's an identity that is concerned with its own existence. They use the term care, or Sorge in German, to also get at this sense. And you may, if you've read Whitehead's, I believe in Adventures of Ideas, as well as Modes of Thought, I think he talks about this Quaker notion of concern that actual occasions of experience have for their own existence, that reality is not just this mutely persisting, meaningless sequence of events, but there are centers of experience for which existence matters, right? And Varela is pointing to this fact, to this interior locus of concern and subjectivity, at least present in the biological world, right? And so he doesn't think anymore at this late stage, this was in 2002, that a merely cybernetic account of the self-regulating, self-organizing dynamics can account for what is truly unique about organisms. Now, the problem here is that even though he's reintroducing subjectivity into biology and value as well, ultimately this autopoietic perspective requires a new kind of gap. It's not a mind-body gap anymore, but it's still this life matter gap, you might say, because at the end of the day, Varela and Weber write here, organisms can be said to transcend the neutrality of pure physics and to create their concern. And so as much as I have learned and appreciated this autopoietic perspective, I feel there's still a missing ontological piece here, which is what is neutral about physics and chemistry, and how could life in this center of concern exist in a universe that before life was just, again, mute matter, meaninglessly enduring. And so I think process philosophy, process ontology can help shore up what's, I think, still lacking in this autopoietic perspective. But it's very clear that by the end of his life, Varela realized the inadequacy of the mechanistic approach because it could not account for this interior phenomenological horizon of concern, which is an organism's concern to continue to exist, but also to enjoy its experience. So that's Varela's contribution here. Now let's get to our book, Spiridon. This book, Intuiting Life, is the subtitle, and it's a response. It's a critical response to this neo-mechanistic perspective. Tell us about the different sort of methodologies at play here, and particularly the role of intuition in correcting this blindness of the abstract intellect. And I know you also wanted to speak to the deceased, our friend, the late Bruno Faulkner, in this context.
Okay, yes. So we'll move now to the third point. The process metaphysical perspective of the book Intuiting Life, a critical response to the neo-mechanistic stance. I should say that initially I suggested that the title of the book should be Intuiting Life, and the subtitle should be Process Philosophical Perspectives on Biology. But the publisher, Cambridge Scholar Publishing, shifted it because they said that the advertisers usually leave out the subtitle and provide only the first title. So if the first title is just Intuiting Life, most people would think that it is something about a sort of a psychological book or something like that, a popular psychological book. Therefore, they made the initial first title of the book to the subtitle. So the book's Intuiting Life was born out of the conviction that intuition must support the life-exploring intellect, because intuition can do justice to those aspects of life that for fundamental reasons go beyond discursive analytical ways of thinking. The editors and authors of the book are convinced that philosophy, and in particular process philosophy, must breathe new life into what has been suppressed by a scientific reductionism. Serving this purpose, Intuiting Life is committed to the maxim that starting from philosophical intuitions, biophilosophy must unveil the abstractions of both biology and philosophy of biology and overcome them with new metaphysical hypotheses. So think here of Whitehead's famous fallacy of misplaced concreteness. To give you an idea of the spirit of the book, I would like to briefly describe one of its chapters. My recently deceased friend, the biology and process thinker Gernot Falkner, to whom this book is dedicated, proceeds from Ernst Haeckel's idea that the ontogeny of unicellular and multicellular living beings is guided by a species-specific memory. Ernst Haeckel was one of the most famous Darwinist biologists and also philosopher. Falkner supplements Haeckel's hypothesis by postulating an individual memory that contains the experiences made by an organism in its individual life history. So I too have many times written about the individual memory of organisms and even of bacteria. And we were in a very intensive communication with Gernot. So Falkner is guided by the intuition that the creative interplay between the creative interplay between species-specific and individual memory underlies the evolution of species, human history, and the emergence of consciousness. The ideas developed in his chapter are based to a large extent on Falkner's decades-long experiments with cyanobacteria. Falkner concludes from his experiments that even the simplest organisms are creative decision-making subjects that have both individual memory and species-specific memory. This allows the organism to link past experiences in such a way that even future events can be anticipated. The organismic experience and interpretation of environmental influences reflects an anticipatory and hermeneutic activity of the organism, which Falkner describes using the means of Whitehead's process philosophy. The evolution of species proceeds stepwise in a spiral upward movement in which individual and species-specific memories within the entire species community interact with each other in complex ways, resulting in more complex eukaryotic species. So he thought that in order to understand the evolution of multicellularity and the evolution of more complex multicellular beings, plants, animals, etc., you need to consider the interaction between the individual memory and the species-specific memory. Higher evolved species arise when useful functional individual memories are incorporated into diverse species-specific memories. Proceeding from Hegel's philosophy of history, Faulkner asserts that, I quote him, organisms liberate themselves to an increasing extent from the uniform determinations of a species-specific memory, which increases the variation of the self-constitution of a species. This, end of quote. This process begins with organisms in which individual memory is an integral part of species-specific memory, and ends with a complete separation of individual memory from species. Again, it ends with a complete separation of individual memory from species-specific memory in human evolution and social history. So this is a very good example of what I understand under biophilosophy. Here you have not only biological facts that follow from 30 and over than 30 years of hard experimental work that he did together with his wife, who is also a biologist. But you see the amalgamation of hard biological facts with process philosophy and with German idealism, in this case with Hegel. So you will never find, but really never find, something similar to that in philosophy of biology. So let's move to the fourth part, a short excursion into the history of the concept of intuition in Occidental philosophy from a process philosophical perspective. This is important because, I mean, there are some good reasons why we called the book Intuiting, gave the title Intuiting life to the book. So I have to explain here, what do we understand actually under intuition? Yeah. So one of the first things that one notices when studying the history of the concept of intuition in Occidental philosophy is that since ancient times, there has been a sharp distinction between intuitive and discursive analytic knowledge. I would say even an antagonism between intuition and discursive analytic cognition. This led to the assumption that these are two fundamentally different and even, as I said, antagonistic forms of knowledge. According to many influential Occidental philosophers, the discursive analytic type of knowledge progresses through the use of general concepts or universals, which are abstract entities. Some of the most influential scholars who explicitly hold this position are Duns Scotus in the 13th century, Spinoza, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche. In contemporary scientific disciplines, most general concepts represent entities, properties such as mass or spin, operations and relationships, for example, forces, that are neither sensually experienceable nor imaginable. Think, for example, of unimaginable entities such as enormous numbers, high-dimensional mathematical spaces, and non-directly observable entities of physics such as elementary particles and astronomical objects. The ability of discursive analytic reason to operate, I mean, I just said astronomical objects, for example, black holes. Nobody has ever observed a black hole directly. The ability of discursive analytic reason to operate with abstract concepts has often led to the judgment that it is superior to the intuitive approach to reality. The supposedly antagonistic relationship between discursive, analytical, and intuitive knowledge has been questioned, for example, in process philosophy. The revolutionary potential and the range of process philosophical insights into the nature of intuition and its relationship to scientific thinking becomes more visible against the background of the long history of the concept of intuition in Occidental philosophy. So the first point is about the meaning of the term intuition in Occidental philosophy. In everyday, in Occidental philosophy, but not in process philosophy. It's important to keep that in mind. In everyday language, the term intuition, derived from the Latin verb intuere, which means to consider, describes the ability to gain insights into a wide variety of facts without the discursive use of reason. That is, without conscious conclusions mediated by general concepts. Against the background of process philosophy, it makes sense to focus on four main points of understanding of intuition in the Occidental philosophy. So my first point is that throughout the history of Western philosophy, intuition has been credited with the ability to grasp its object suddenly, instantaneously, and directly. The immediacy of intuitive knowledge claimed by Themistius and Philoponus in the late antiquity, Thomas of Aquinas, John Locke, Leibniz, Schelling, Edward von Hartmann, and other thinkers is opposed to discursive knowledge, which arises slowly and step by step. My second point, according to some eminent philosophers, intuitive cognition can only be mediated through the senses. Intuition is then reduced to an exclusively sensually mediated activity, which recognizes the nature of objects, their features, and some of the relationships between them, for example, equality, likeness, or inequality of material things, only if it is dealing with physically existing things presented to the senses. This idea was advocated by Duns Scotus, Maimon, Solomon Maimon, a German Jewish philosopher of the late 18th century who interacted with Immanuel Kant, then Schopenhauer and Kant himself. From this perspective, the intuitive act appears as an automatic, spontaneous, immediate, and effortless cognitive process that produces pure evidence. My third point, this understanding of intuition contrasts with that of thinkers who acknowledge the existence of another form of intuition that does not require the presence of physical objects, as it can be conveyed through thinking, imagination, and experiencing one's own consciousness. René Descartes, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Edmund Husserl, and Benedetto Croce, an Italian philosopher who lived in the 19th and I think until the mid of the 20th century, and is famous for his contribution to philosophy of aesthetics. My last point, some of the most influential thinkers in the history of Occidental philosophy share the belief that the contents provided by intuition are the simplest and most indisputable elements from which knowledge can emerge. For example, that 2 + 2 makes 4. Everybody sees this immediately. So in this sense, my fourth point is about understanding intuition as self-evidence, as providing self-evident knowledge. So Descartes, Spinoza, Locke, Leibniz, Hume, and Maimon support this position. Starting from this assumption, many other philosophers since late antiquity have come to the conclusion that intuition is an infallible an infallible mental faculty, a judgment that has not gone unchallenged, however. So the infallibility of intuition is represented, for example, by Themistius and Philoponus in late antiquity, Aquinas in the medieval time, Descartes, Spinoza, Locke, and the Polish phenomenologist and Husserl's disciple Roman Ingarden. Now, the last section, the conception of intuition in the metaphysics of Henri Bergson. One of the main, so now we turn to process philosophy, to a process philosophical understanding of intuition, which strongly contrasts to the traditional understanding of intuition, I think. One of the main pillars of Bergson's thinking is his understanding of intuition. I distinguish the following aspects of Bergson's conception of intuition. The first aspect, intuition as a form of sympathy. Bergson often credits the observing subject with the ability to empathize with its object through a form of sympathy that presupposes the attribution of inwardness and thus a certain subjectivity to the object. Bergson often cites the example of the painter who intuitively overcomes the distance that space puts up between him and his model and empathizes with the object. Intuition then is a cognitive faculty that overcomes the spatial distance between the subject and its object. So this is the aspect of intuition's theory of Bergson that is closer than all the others to the tradition, to the philosophical tradition. The second point, intuition is not limited to physically present beings. Another important aspect of Bergson's theory of intuition is that the subject cannot sympathize solely with actually existing physical objects, as in the case of the artist depicting a model. Bergson refers to the form of intuition that depends on the senses as sensible intuition. However, he also emphasizes that the human subject has an intuitive capacity that enables it to empathize with even imaginary beings, like a fictional character in a novel. In other words, some intuitions are not conveyed through sense perception, but through other mental faculties, such as imagination and thinking. The third aspect of Bergson's theory of intuition, philosophical intuition, questions habits of thought. So now we will be talking about, I will be talking about philosophical intuition, a very particular form of intuition that is made very explicit in Bergson's writings. The intuitive act often begins with a refusal to follow commonly accepted ideas that are taken for granted. A key feature of Bergson's critique of modern rationality and science stems from his pragmatist belief that both the unquestioned habits of everyday thinking and some of the deep-seated modes of thought that dominate various scientific discourses are unconsciously rooted in the human intellect's utilitarian approach to reality. The latter, however, our utilitarian approach to reality, conceals the complexity of reality in order to show ways of its practical and technological manipulation. It is therefore an important task of the philosopher, I quote Bergson, to start up a certain effort which the utilitarian efforts of everyday life tend in most men to discourage. End of quote. This aspect of his theory of intuition shows that Bergson is primarily concerned with a philosophical form of intuition. Philosophical intuition begins with a refusal to follow commonly accepted ideas that are taken for granted. I quote, It seems to me that intuition often behaves in speculative matters, like the demon of Socrates in practical life. It forbids. Faced with currently accepted ideas, theses which seemed evident, affirmations which had up to that time passed as scientific, it whispers into the philosopher's ear the word impossible. What a strange force this intuitive power of negation is. The fourth aspect, philosophical intuition creates fluid concepts. For example, concepts like individual memory, species-specific memory, and other concepts that we have used in our book. Bergson's belief that intuition, especially when it acts philosophically, must break with comfortable habits of thinking corresponds to his conviction that the metaphysician cannot operate with ready-made concepts, but has to create fluid concepts. I quote, "Metaphysics is strictly itself only when it frees itself of the inflexible and ready-made concepts and creates others, very different from those we usually handle." And I would say we usually handle not only in everyday life, but also in science. I mean flexible, mobile, almost fluid representations, always ready to mold themselves on the fleeting forms of intuition. End of quote. For Bergson, to philosophize means to, I quote again, to go from reality to concepts and not from concepts to reality. This means, end of quote. This means, however, that the metaphysician cannot have the concepts available at the beginning of her analysis. The fluid concepts can only be gained through a long, arduous, empathetic, and philosophical examination of the object. In other words, philosophical intuition is not something that arises suddenly and spontaneously, etc. It needs, as I said, long, arduous, empathetic, and philosophical examination of its objects. Fifth point, intuition and intellect. When Bergson says in Creative Evolution, I quote, that intellect remains the illuminated core, end of quote, around which intuition must form, he points to a balanced relationship between the two cognitive faculties. So there is no antagonism between discursive analytic knowledge and philosophical intuition in Bergson. There is tension between them, but not an unbridgeable antagonism. In this regard, the following statement is particularly illuminating. Each of these two lines of inquiry, intuition and intellect, leads to the other. They form a circle, and the only center this circle can have is the empirical study of evolution. In other words, according to Bergson, the study of life is the fulcrum around which the co-evolution of intuition and intellect will unfold. The marriage of intuition and intellect, of intuitive and discursive analytic knowledge demanded by Bergson, is a core feature of his theory of intuition. And now the last, but not least aspect, philosophical intuition is not infallible. Intuition as conceived by Bergson is not a faculty that grasps the indubitable, but brings to the surface subtle, hidden, and perhaps also repressed insights into the nature of life and reality as a whole. In particular, philosophical intuition cannot be infallible, since it is a skill tied to working with concepts. The conceptually operating exploration of reality extends over long historical periods, and even, I would say, even relies on error as one of its most important driving factors. fallibility then is not only an essential feature of philosophical intuition, but is even indispensable to it. From this, it might be concluded that philosophical intuition not only is not infallible, but I would say rather should not be. So this is what I wanted to say about Bergson. And the reason why I made this this excursus in on the one hand on the history of the theory of the concept of intuition in Occidental philosophy and Bergson's theory of intuition is that I wanted to show that there is a strong contrast between them. And when we talk about intuiting life, we mean philosophical intuitions, making philosophical intuitions fruitable. I don't know, maybe this was not the right word, make them useful for exploring biophilosophical possibilities. And we mean actually philosophical intuitions that are important in process philosophy. And therefore, I would like to give to Matt the last word, the final word, and ask you to introduce us to some of Whitehead's key philosophical intuitions that are, in your opinion, relevant to a processual biophilosophy.
Sure. Thank you, Spiridon. Very helpful history and conceptual analysis there. I'll be brief because I want to make sure we have lots of time for discussion here. But, I think of Whitehead's inheritance of so much of Bergson's thought. And in Process and Reality, he makes this distinction between two different types of analysis, morphological analysis and genetic analysis. And morphological analysis is what Bergson might call the logic of solid bodies. It's what the intellect forces on. It's focuses on, and it's what allows us to make precise measurements of the sort of already finished physical world. But the genetic analysis would be more like this fluid logic that would draw more on intuition, where we're looking at what's going on inside of concrescence, which is this creative dimension of nature that's immeasurable. If Tim Eastman were still here, he would point out that it's non-Boolean. It can't be reduced to an either-or type of logic, as one can do when one does morphological analysis. And Whitehead is here trying to show the value of both forms of analysis, but that the exclusively intellectual mechanistic forms of analysis that focus on the sort of already finished measurable shapes of the physical world just leaves out this living dimension of nature, which intuition grants us access to. And I also wanted to point out what this quote Jay already shared. I had the same page of Process and Reality open where Whitehead talks about sympathy, and this feeling of organisms being able to be in sympathetic resonance with one another, and also this idea of non-sensuous perception in Whitehead is akin to a Bergsonian intuition, where emotion would be a great example of non-sensuous perception. It's not perception through any of the five senses. It's what Whitehead would call a non-sensuous form of perception. And so rather than thinking of emotion as just inside and private, which it has that aspect to it, it's also something that's transmitted to us from the environment, and we can come to share in the emotional feelings of the other organisms around us. It's a very novel idea that comes from this process orientation. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much, Spiridon, for sharing your expertise with us today. I learned a lot listening. So